Excellent. Thank you everyone for joining. Feel free to put your cameras on, say where you're coming from, where you're dialing in from in the chat. We're excited for today's session and we'll kick things off. So my name is Allard. I'm one of the co-founders of RegenIntel, which is a climate and regenerative consultancy and education company. And we are committed to transforming humanity into a climate positive species, a planet positive species. So we're here today to talk about one of the ways of doing that, which is through entrepreneurship, through founding entities, whether it's for-profit or non-profit entities, and supporting the transition of humanity using that approach. How we're going to do that is we have invited some experts in this area. These are persons who have had a lot of experience in doing this around the world in various regions of the world, in various approaches, and by funding this through various means also. And I'm going to introduce them. But these are important persons, important discussions, and an important approach for achieving what we call in RegenIntel a regenerative world. So regeneration means a world where humanity benefits from and contributes to nature, where life is at the center, where our organizations or institutions or behaviors put life and well-being of the planet and of ourselves at the center of everything we do. So here at RegenIntel, we would like to invite you all to come with an open mind, come with your questions, come with your thinking caps, come with your interaction ready. Feel free to start to comment in the chat room. We're going to be sharing a lot of information here. And we'd love to have, after the first few minutes of discussion with the guests today, some questions from you. If you want to, just type them in the chat or you want to speak them, that's great. And we'll welcome all of that. So we're going to go through some introductions, we're going to have a discussion and then the Q&A, and then we'll wind up within this hour with a bit of a closing and some gifts for you all just for attending today, all right? So I'm going to introduce our three esteemed guests today. We have Joyeeta Das. So Joyeeta is the founder and CEO of Samudra Oceans. This is a company that combines AI, robotics, seaweed farming to capture carbon dioxide and drive food innovation. COP People's Choice Award winner, Joyeeta brings expertise in venture finance, grants, and crowdfunding. We also have Vincent or Vin van der Holst. He's the founder and CEO of BOAS. This is a profit-for-good company revolutionizing fashion sustainability through creative financing strategies like equity crowdfunding, bootstrapping, and debt finance. And finally, we have Diana Denke. She's the founder and CEO of Fair Carbon, which is a Swiss non-profit working to protect and restore the world's marine and coastal ecosystems. Fair Carbon envisions a world where high-integrity carbon and nature markets is booming, and it's an integral part to the global economy. All right, so with our three guests, welcome. So we're going to start right off with Joyeeta, right? So now Joyeeta she's been an innovator for quite some time, right? Joyeeta is at least a three-time innovator, and you can correct me there, with how many entities you've created at this point. So you've done work in data, in AI, etc., and you've now developed Samudra Oceans, which is a marine climate company. So we want to understand a bit of why you pivoted, what you found that was interesting and attractive, and what were the opportunities in this space that encouraged you to pivot into climate, and what do you think are some continuing opportunities for other innovators out there? Joyeeta?
Thanks a lot, Ryan, for asking that question, because it's quite existential, to be honest, about climate. I think at some point in my career, particularly around when we have a pandemic and everybody was at home overthinking, I was doing the same, overthinking and sitting at home. And looking at my career as a tech entrepreneur and an engineer, I was thinking that every company is a climate company, whether or not we realize it. Because we take from the climate and we affect the climate. And it's the invisible stakeholder and shareholder in everything we do. And so if every company is a climate company, I thought, as an engineer, what should I be building in 2022, sitting in 2022? What should I be building for? And to me, it seems that whatever I should be building next, climate should not be the invisible stakeholder that I take for granted, but it should be the driving force and the design behind my thoughts, because it's the single most biggest driver of world economics, well-being, and to be honest, our entire future. And so it was a very data-driven decision. It also came a lot from my heart. And I also did the Ikigai exercise. What's my skill set? What am I passionate about? Where will I make money and where's the impact? And it turned out to be climate, particularly ocean, because that's the community that I grew up as. My mom's a conservation botanist. So basically it all came together. And it seemed like the most natural next step as far as my heart and my mind was concerned.
Excellent. Okay, so there's a bit of thinking, a bit of reflection. That's a key part of all of this, I think. Many people have that process, whether it's thinking about, like you said, your childhood, or thinking about what you're seeing in the world today and some of the challenges that we're experiencing. That's a key part of that decision. And I want to maybe get some perspectives from Diana here on this, because Diana, I think, has been involved in the climate and regenerative space a bit longer. Diana, was it a similar process for you to focus on starting an organization within the climate and regenerative space, or was it a different process? Tell us.
Yeah, well, so, I went to business school, and then inevitable consequence, I landed as a management consultant, and I worked at Bain & Company for 2 years, and another consulting company. And really that was an incredible professional experience in a way where it teaches you certain, I would say, courage with which you can problem solve, and it gives you a really broad scope of challenges that you're looking at and you're trying to contribute to. But at one point, I think many people in the consulting industry will end up feeling that, okay, it's great that I'm able to give advice, and lo and behold, sometimes that advice is even being taken and implemented, but your work is finished with handing over that advice. And for me, there was a much deeper desire to actually build something, to execute something, to see that the strategic thinking that we're putting forth about how do we want to see certain systems change are actually happening. And so it was a gradual process for me, because initially I just moved into a role where we were supporting nature-based solution projects in Indonesia and some of these social enterprises on how they can stop the deforestation of the tropical rainforest. And we were giving them financing and advice. But then I realized even that is too short of a time frame, and I want to be engaged with the topic longer, because actually that is when you can understand some of the systemic issues and understand what the really deep challenges are, and try to come up with solutions and then once you come up with those solutions, they need also time to take an effect. So for me, building an organization and becoming a founder was a really excellent way to get into it, gets my hands dirty, so to speak.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, those elements of trying to change systems, change people's perspectives, change behaviors takes a lot of time. Yeah, and sometimes people don't remember that, you're changing. Sometimes you focus on the big businesses or the politician, but the behaviors of consumers is also very important, right? And that takes time for people to learn all of this. Now, I know that you have a diverse, Diana, you have a diverse educational background. And you mentioned a bit about, having the MBA, but you also studied psychology, you studied sustainability leadership. How did those fit into all of this? Did you find them critical for making that decision, or did you make the decision and then go seek the requisite education?
Well, so I think what that tells you is that I love learning and I'm very curious by nature, and there's a lot of subjects that fascinate me. In today's age, I don't think that kind of, you don't need to collect 5 degrees to do something. I mean, self-learning is becoming so important, and knowledge and information is more available than ever. I mean, just look at the course that you are starting. So, my path was much more around questioning at which point do I want to act, and I was moving from a system change perspective, where my initial degree was in diplomacy and international relations, then concluding, and I wrote my thesis on climate refugees 12 years ago, when that wasn't a thing at all, And then I concluded that, oh, it's really difficult to change society, to change our economic system. Let me just focus on one person at a time. Then I went to psychology. And then I realized that, okay, for psychology, I have a little bit too much fire in me, or too much action. And maybe at a later age, I will be able to coach people and sit and listen and help them move. But now I kind of also want to be in the doing of things. And so the MBA was already something that enabled me to bring together all these different interests. And actually, I'm grateful when I did my MBA. It was already like business schools were not just for people aspiring to go into investment banking or corporate careers or consulting. It was also very much social entrepreneurship, social impact. Sustainability was on the radar. And so for me, that I already knew that I wanted to then go into that path. And now, frankly, with this whole regenerative movement, I just feel that all of those different interests are coming together in a quite natural way, where we are seeing that you cannot think in terms of those silos anymore. Like, if you do want to think about regeneration, it has elements of psychology, it has elements of behavior change, as you mentioned, of ecology, of political science, of economics. So I think that's quite a fascinating world that we live in, where those multidisciplinary thinking is becoming the norm, if I can say that.
Yeah, awesome, awesome. And Vin, you've pulled some of those together in the work you do at BOAS, right? So maybe you can tell us a bit about that. You have a very creative campaign for transforming how the vintage jeans industry. It includes engaging with people, consumers, for changing the behavior. It includes, of course, getting the financing, which we'll talk about. It includes some maybe radical campaigns. How do you think about pulling all these elements together in the work you do at BOAS to transform the fashion industry?
So what we do with BOAS is what we call profit for good. Is you start a for-profit company and you make your shareholder an NGO that in our case saves lives. And that profit for good model is most known by Patagonia, who switched to that I think slightly over a year ago. But other well-known examples are Bosch, Rolex is one, Carl Zeiss. Like, those are the very big ones. And then there's lots of, well, there's starting to be a growing number of start and scale ups in that area as well. So what we've done is said, okay, let's try and make profit in a good way with what we call fast vintage fashion platform. We try and make vintage fast so it can compete with fast fashion. And then if we make profit, we use that to save lives. So that is actually, in essence, it's just a tiny tweak of the capitalist system. Is you still keep that system, but you just say we're going to use that profit to fund some of the world's biggest problems. And those can be climate change, and we chose actually to save lives, and our business is a climate business. So that's how we kind of trying to combine those things.
And the decision to actually launch BOAS, was it as a communal thing? You're talking with your partners from previous initiatives and you found that there's a gap. How did that lead? How did your history lead to that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I studied business and economics and entrepreneurship. I have an MBA as well, and then I didn't really do anything with that in my career. I started doing marketing. I sold everything from anything that startups sold to massive multinationals like Samsung and Adidas. And I started to also get that feeling like I've never been a consumer, actually. I don't like stuff. So it became a bit weird for me to sell so much. And then I wanted to do something with impact. So I started working with NGOs. I work with UNHCR, Red Cross, War Child, a bunch of bigger Dutch ones. And so I work with the companies who are making billions, and then with some of the larger NGOs, and then often the yearly budget of the NGO is what some of those large companies made in a day or a weekend. And that question of like, you hear that a lot, like there's not enough money to solve climate change, there's not enough money to solve preventable death. Like there is absolutely enough money to solve these problems, but it's not in the right places. And that question has never really let me go. And I thought about that for probably a year before I took action. When I realized, like, hey, I like for-profit businesses. That's what I think I'm good at. That's a source of almost all wealth. Like, can we not be using that? Can we not persuade entrepreneurs to use their profit for good? So I started one, basically. That's how that came to be.
Great. Okay. And you made an interesting point there about the need to, well, you hinted at it, the need to change the economic system that we're living in through these new innovations, right? And I wonder, so you decided to take a change to the profit model, you call it profit for good, in order to do that. And I know that, one of the reasons why this is a diverse panel, I think, is because you've each taken a different approach to that, right? So I wonder from Diana's perspective and Joyeeta, what do you think drove you to choose the vehicles that you've chosen, right? So Diana, you've taken a nonprofit, a Swiss nonprofit, as a way to help protect the oceans, and Joyeeta, you've taken a for-profit model as a way to do the same, to reduce emissions. So any thoughts on the correct vehicle for having the kind of impact you want? And of course, part of that impact too is your own livelihood. So any thoughts on that? Maybe Diana, you first?
Yeah, well, this is okay, so I think the boundaries are getting a little bit blurred there. And, with the for-profit but public benefit corporation, the social enterprise, there are so many models. And I think, I also want to highlight and emphasize that while we went the nonprofit route, my mission is to make this into a revenue generating, financially self-sustaining nonprofit. Because I don't want us to be dependent on philanthropic funding forever. I don't think that is something that is very sustainable. And I also think that, there is nothing wrong with generating revenue as long as you're creating value. Then the bigger question is, how do you frame that? Like, as a nonprofit, we're not profit seeking, but we could have equally chosen an organizational form that says, we are a for-profit company that has certain bylaws and clauses that allows us to reinvest the profit into some public good or expansion or whatever. And I don't think there is one good answer. It's something that every founder needs to go through on their own, and it also depends on what is the type of investment that you want to attract. We are funded by a venture philanthropy. So for us, the nonprofit is a good fit for now, but there are other things that we may be doing, like setting up an accelerator fund. And if the investors want that to be a separate entity, then it cannot be run through the nonprofit organizations. And there's so many limitations on each side that you just need to be aware of and tune it into what you want to achieve and basically with whom.
Okay. Joyeeta, any thoughts?
Yeah, I really agree with Diana. I think the lines are getting very blurred these days, and it's really hard to categorize things with a very strict dotted line or a hard line on what is for-profit, non-profit, because even if you say for-profit, it's probably the kind of for-profit where we have recognized our invisible stakeholders to be climate and making that a big beneficiary. I guess the other practical response to the question is, I think in the end, impact is a combination of the macro and also what you as an individual are good at. So my background is very hardcore tech and amplifying tech. I worked in the Silicon Valley, I exited companies, I worked for the top tech companies and made them millions. So what I really know as a skill set is how to take something tech, amplify it, and be able to work with the economic instrument, which means I also see all its weaknesses as an insider. And I've done this for over a decade. So it seems like the instrument that I'm very good at using is that. And when I was thinking of the macro impact that I want to create, I thought that if I go and learn a completely new instrument and spend 5 years being good at it, I may lose valuable time. I wanted to use what I already have, but use it in a different way. By the way, one way we are actually using it inside the company, and this might be interesting for anyone here who's interested in the mechanics of how it works. So a lot of our engineers who design large-scale carbon capture using aquaculture are ex-oil and gas. They used to work for Exxon, Shell, and BP of the world, but they're very good at designing floating engineering rigs. So now they're designing it for us. So the tech that used to add carbon is being used to remove carbon. And I thought I would take the same model in my head. I was very good at making tech companies make millions. I was very good at making my own tech companies, exiting 2 of them in a row. And I thought, why don't I do this for the climate model and make sure there's some income going into that side of the economy using my skill sets and connection.
Yes, it's a very strategic approach where you take what you're good at and you have to do that inner work, like we said earlier, that introspection to figure out where you really want to fit in and therefore be more directed in where you put your time. And I remember hearing one of maybe an advisor for founders say something along the lines of, what you do in order to be successful is important, but where you put your time is probably the most important decision, right? Because we're only here for a limited time on Earth, and of course, you have to commit several years for any of these initiatives to be successful. So let's talk a bit about success, what that means to you, right? So success, of course, in a nonprofit, and we talk about the blended versions of that too, and then for-profit and all the different versions of that mean different things. But for you personally, what does success mean? It's a very open-ended one, so take it any way you want it. Any volunteers?
I can go because I have one liner. I want to take out 1 gigaton of carbon before 2033. I've committed myself to that. If I get even close to that number, it's success for me. That's the number. That's what I want to capture in the ocean. That's where I'm going at. It will obviously create thousands of jobs, which is a great KPI as well. But for me, the main is if I take out 1 gigaton in 10 years, then I've done it.
Excellent. Vincent, Diana?
Like massive term success for me would be that our company saves 1 billion fashion items from dumping or burning. And then if we do that, we almost certainly make enough profit to save at least 10,000 lives. That would be my dream. So that's always the aim. I think that's similar to what Joyeeta said. Like we're dreaming big. Do I think we're gonna get there? Statistically unlikely, maybe, but we're going to try.
Okay, excellent. Dana?
Yeah, well, in terms of fair carbon, success for us would mean that the blue carbon market experiences an exponential growth. And we would, short term, I want to make fair carbon financially self-sustaining, so that is a success. But long term, it should be an organization that self-liquidates, because everything that we're providing is should only be for a transitory period. The knowledge on blue carbon and how to get projects accredited, the early stage financing, the policy research, we're only doing it because it's not available. But once the market actually grows, this knowledge becomes more commonplace, then we don't need to exist. Then local communities can just benefit and be fairly rewarded for their efforts to restore those ecosystems, because they have everything they need to get it done. But I want to add a personal point, since you asked what is personal success. And I just think that, we live in truly extraordinary times, but it also comes with, especially for people like us who think about what does it mean in terms of the economic system and regeneration and climate change. It can come with quite a lot of anxiety or weight or pressure that you're carrying. And you say oh, we only have a couple of decades to make those changes, or, so that your whole lifetime kind of carries that weight. And for me, personal success is actually living a life where at the end I can holistically say that I'm happy with it. Like I contributed to it in different buckets, and that includes health, friendships, spirituality, social contribution, intellectual work, family, friends. So I'm really trying to look at my own life in this holistic way as well, because otherwise, if I'm just getting into this tunnel vision that this generation needs to change the course of history, it can get quite heavy. So something in our organization also advocates for this holistic lifestyle and finding the joy in every day.
Absolutely. We're only 20 minutes in and we're already getting very deep here because these are very important things that maybe we don't talk enough about. So I really appreciate that, Diana, and Joyeeta, and Vincent, all of you. Thank you for that. So it seems like there's an important element here of just being a founder and being clear on why you're a founder, what you want to accomplish. Your own strengths, right? Understanding your weaknesses, understanding how you're going to turn that into something that's larger than you, that maybe even outlasts you. And of course, figuring out what's the specifics of your accomplishment, your goal, your marker. What's that marker you're trying to accomplish? Or like we said, RegenIntel, the marker on the horizon, right? So both from your perspective, your organization's or your goals perspective, and the world's perspective. These are important things. It's really an inner work that needs to start all of that, right? So we've talked about the high level, but let's talk about some tactical elements here, right? Let's talk a bit about the side of getting your operation up and running and the need for funding, right? So as we said, we need funding to make these things work of different types, maybe different structures, different time periods, etc. So how do you think about funding at all? Right, so maybe we'll start with you, Joyeeta, because you've had experience raising funding for your previous ventures, right? So you've raised millions of pounds of funding for Guyana, for instance, right? And now you're doing something in the regenerative or climate space. So there must have been changes in your approach here. So maybe you could tell us how you've thought about funding for your previous ventures that were not climate related, and now how you've changed that with some years of experience fundraising for Samudra, which from what I've seen publicly, has already raised some funds, right? And then I will start us off.
It's a really good question because funding strategy is such a big part of success because it's fuel that goes into the company. And to be honest, even as an investor, so I am also various funds and boards that invest. One of the key things I look at is also how the founder is thinking about funding strategy and given what they're doing, because it's a big indicator of how they will be able to organize fuel and resources for their planning. You can have the best plans. You don't have the fuel, it's not going to work. Funding strategy for climate, specifically for hard tech or infrastructure or step change innovation, is not straightforward. It's not just VC funding or angel funding. You have to think of a combination. And the moment I say combination, I know a lot of people think grants. Yes, that too, but there's many other ways. So I think for elements that appeal to public, you can do crowdfunding. I've looked at it. I've had various amounts of success. I've advised people to do it on the boards that I'm at. It has worked well because the crowd is very conscious about climate funding. I've also found reasonable interest in certain types of asset-backed financing, specifically what you're doing involves agriculture or ownership of Quebec and things like that. You can have asset-backed financing, you can have venture debt, and you can have debt bank loans, which are at a low rate of interest, especially in SID, small island developing states. So we have farms in Jamaica. We are now looking at acquiring some more farms in a couple of other Caribbean islands. We have some collaborative projects in Canada and Scotland. And all the sites are funded differently. It's not one size fits all. And then we have venture capital funding at the top co-level, where all the tech is sitting. So we've looked at financing as a portfolio of solutions. And we look at venture debt, subscription, crowdfunding, project financing. There's a lot of project financing, specifically around carbon credits. And the most exciting and interesting one, the one that I love and highly advocate founders to go for, is pre-sold revenue. Because it's non-dilutive, doesn't sit in your ownership structure. And it's just, imagine the cost of capital. You are being paid what you would be paid 2 years or 7 years later, but today. So that's great for you from an NPV perspective. And it's just revenue, which is great traction and proof for further fundraising. So we do have forward selling both blue carbon as well as blue carbon credits contracts with verified and unverified agencies. We also have actual revenue contracts for our tech and our site. And that has been very, very positive. So it's a portfolio of solutions. It's not one size fits all. And you have to think a bit creatively. And the last thing I want to mention here is, I think founders these days, I think they fall into a lot of hubris because there's a whole glamorized world of venture capital funding, which seems to be the only way you're very good or you're validated. Unless you've been on the cover of TechCrunch, you're not good. Climate people walk away from that. That's not our mantra. We're not here to look post. We're here to get real stuff done. So take capital that actually makes sense for you. I have turned down capital where mine and the funder's vision, the fund actually vision did not align. I wasn't comfortable with what I think they'll bring to the capital. And God, am I glad I didn't take that money. Eventually, the people that I got on board, they're incredible. As of this morning, we had a massive crisis, and the way they've dealt with it is beautiful. So when you have people who are aligned on the vision, you get incredible output. So be careful about the capital, look for patient capital, or look for capital with some amount of conscience and mandates attached to it, and then look at capital as a portfolio solution. So having a good plan, not just like a funding model, but having a real plan on how you're going to fund for next 2, 6, 12, 15, 18 months, and having 5 scenarios, A, B, C, D, E, and how you're going to go funding each of those portfolio scenarios is a very good way to think. And bringing advisors and CFOs and financial controllers who can support with that is a mark of a really strong foundation or a good company. And even as an investor, I look for that.
Excellent. Wow. Yeah, I remember seeing it was one of those flow diagrams of where the funding for climate work, for instance, comes from. And there was a tiny sliver that was VC, right? The vast majority were other sources, whether it's grants from governments or investments or whatever it is. Private also is massive, but of course, getting into those rooms in order to have those discussions is quite a challenge. So maybe you could follow up, Joyeeta, with a few points on that. If you've identified a certain type of funding, let's say maybe only 3 big buckets. Ventures one, let's say there's government funding, which includes everything, including grants, etc., and maybe private sector funding that's not venture, but it's companies, etc. How do you even make those discussions happen?
Yeah, really good question, because getting into the right room is everything. You know that, Alan, even before you ask the question, that is everything, right? If you're in the right place, a lot can happen. How do you identify the right places? And for me, that is usually thinking backward, just like you think about customer fit. Where is the customer likely to be, and how do you find that? So where are carbon project future financing likely to be, other than COP and Davos? They're likely to be in carbon forwards or those conferences. Where are philanthropic family offices meeting every year? They're meeting in LP-specific events in New York and Chicago and Geneva and Germany and Switzerland. So think backwards and do some research on the people that you're trying to find. Where do they all meet, even if it's not a proximity? And you go find them there. The second thing is digital. Surprise, surprise, the world's quite small thanks to LinkedIn. If you make a very compelling pitch, people do give you a second response. A cold email is perfectly fine if it's a very targeted email. It works. I have made 2-liners to some of the most hard to get cakes in the Middle East, and they have responded. And they've said, oh, that sounds compelling. And I have gotten to a meeting, which took a month to set up, but I got it, So I think that digital work makes it easy. Make it a compelling and a very short argument. Don't write a long paragraph. No one has time for that. Write what this person wants to hear in the first sentence, and they will try to talk to you. And then also these kind of events. The one thing I would say is avoid the standard, very VC-specific event. Just like you say, climate financing doesn't come from mainstream VC. So you can go to Flush or Web Summit or whatever all you want. you're going to get lots of meetings. They're not going to convert because you're not in their mandate. So that's one thing. The last but not least that actually works and I found helps is inbound. So like you're doing these events online. So if you can do very specific targeted events and webinars that actually deliver value for the kind of investors you're trying to attract. Top 3 types of companies to invest. 3 of us are talking this month, register free. You'll start to get people actually interested in you, attending you proactively. And then it's just so much easier. They're already there in the room with you. You didn't go to their room, they came to yours. So inbound works the same way it works for anything else, for investment. And the last thing I would say is, last but not least, is don't underestimate the power of favors. People like straightforward favors. I do it for people all the time, and I like it when people do it for me. You don't have to be great friends, and you don't have to offer a lot of returns. If you're just honest and ping someone and say, you know, the Minister of Trade, and I will have this thing, would you introduce me? One liner, no bullshit. Pardon my French. People do it, you know, because everybody understands that's work. And it's actually quite appreciated if you do that way rather than run around the business. So look at your contacts and find their second order contacts. Long story short, use LinkedIn a lot.
Excellent. Yeah, and that last element there about networking, and I know a lot of people find networking a dirty word, right? But it's really giving value to others, building relationships, and things like what you're saying there, you know, what come out of it, you know. Vin, I want to turn to you because you have a lot of experience doing crowdfunding for BOAS and I think some other initiatives, and you've had some very public creative approaches to get attention. So why don't you wheel in how you think of funding? Give us a bit more about your campaign, your cycling campaign, for instance, and other related campaigns that use crowdfunding. And if you could mention if and to what extent you use tools like AI in the entire crowdfunding thinking and execution, that would be useful.
Great. So I wanted to play devil's advocate about Joyeeta said something about writing cold, short emails. Sometimes I write very long, heartfelt ones, and they have great reply rates too. But like for example, in my life I've emailed 4 New York Times bestsellers, and 3 of them replied, and those were always very long emails. But I knew their work deeply. Like I read their books, I read their articles. Like it was clear that, you know, I was not just trying to ask for a favor. So it was still very compelling, but it was long, and I would like usually apologize for that upfront. So that can work too, but generally I would also revert to short and compelling. But I just wanted to show that perspective too. But I guess about our fundraising strategy, we are in a very weird situation that we are not interesting for profit, but we are not non-profit either. So philanthropists look at us and they're like confused, and venture capitalists will laugh in our face, right? Because we don't, like, we're never ever going to generate the returns that they want. So frankly, we've struggled a lot, and that's how we've become more creative. So we did crowdfunding, we sold equity. I must say that was very hard too. So because we generate returns for life-saving charities, we see that we had quite a number of people invest, but those amounts were smaller than people investing in for-profits. So what you see is that I've definitely seen that return is still king, also in impact and also in climate. That is, I would say, absolutely true. We actually just started a for-profit company, and it's at least 10 times easier to raise money for that. And I don't think it's necessarily a better business model or idea. So I wanted to say that as well. Like most impact and climate investors, I believe, are return driven. So that's something you should take to heart. But what what we did is, I think we work on the story quite a lot. You know, we appeal to the emotion, and I ask people all the time. That's how we get most of the money. We ask. You know, you ask for personal favors. I also do a lot of people favors, and then sometimes that returns. And I think the other thing is also just not giving up. I've had multiple times now, like where people just say like, oh, I put 5,000 euros in your in your equity crowdfunding because like you don't give up. So I think you're going to do it because like, why are you not giving up? Because it's basically it took me a very long time to get anything off the ground with the model, and like absolutely the most rational thing would have been to just give up. What we also do to get in attention is to be creative. So that gets me to a world record that I actually broke this year. So I'm now still unofficially, because Guinness has to approve it, but I'm unofficially the holder of the world record of cycling without hands, which is a very Dutch thing to do with me. And we did that for fundraising actually. So like 100% of what we raised, we would donate to save lives, and that helped us show donations while we were still unprofitable, because you can donate 90% of your profits as a startup, but that will be €0, right, or dollars. So we do creative campaigns to generate some donations. For example, instead of paying for recruitment, I will write on LinkedIn like, I'll donate €1 for each share, I'll donate 5 for each comment, and then that, you know, that gets picked up by the algorithm, because people are like, yeah, sure, I'll like for €1, sure, I'll write a comment for €5 donation, and then your LinkedIn post gets, you know, like 10 or 20,000 people reach, and you actually get like 50 applications. So the world record was something that was obviously like very interesting for PR. So it was in like we were on most radio stations, and I have it in the back here, but that's one of the Dutch newspapers was on the front cover. So yeah, you have to get creative, and that's going to be different for everyone. But I feel like the people who invested in us, they're not really interested in, some are, but most are interested in the story and not really in the financials. They're interested in the story about not giving up, trying to change the system. I don't feel like they're looking at, okay, what's your valuation, what's your
Right.
EBITDA, like, so, and I'm a rationalist, so I did that wrong in the beginning. I was like, you know, we have really good gross margins, and if this grows, it can become very profitable, and you know, all the typical stuff. But actually what appeals in crowdfunding, I believe, is, you know, a beautiful pitch deck, good pictures, a cool video, some good
And
PR.
story.
Yeah, and that's also how, for example, I did a TEDx talk. Like, that's actually a thing that's very achievable, you know, like I was like, okay, it would probably be helpful to have given a TEDx talk. So I just wrote a couple TEDx's with my story. And then if you have a good story, it's not that hard actually to get on a TEDx. So I think about these things quite a lot. Like, you know, how can I elevate my own credibility? Because what I've also learned is that I can say that my business is great, but people are like, yeah, of course he's going to say that. So make other people say that, right? Or say that on the stage of TEDx, and then other people will believe it, right?
Right.
Even though it doesn't really, in my opinion, it doesn't really matter, but those things do help. And maybe to round off, I do use LinkedIn as well. Like we just got a really high level advisor, and I had 9 mutual connections with that guy, and I knew that he was interested in the product, the new product that we're building. So I asked like all those 9 people, like, send him the video, and then he reached out to me. So I actually didn't reach out to him. I had like 9 people who were connected, ask him like, oh, you know, write something about, did you see this? And then he got really excited about that, and now he's one of our advisors. I would definitely ask mutual connections to make introductions, and you'll be quite surprised that way.
Excellent. Thank you for that comprehensive answer. It looks like Joyeeta had to step away because I know she has some other initiatives to work on. But Diana, in our last few minutes here, before we switch to questions, what are your thoughts on fundraising? Vincent mentioned a lot of things about story, about how much people donate to nonprofits versus for-profits. How are you thinking of all of this? And what are some of the most effective strategies you've found so far?
Yeah, well, I mean, just listening to you two, it's clear that you have to become so creative because when you're working on anything that is non-traditional and regenerative, it's like mainstream finance doesn't necessarily understand it yet. And mainstream finance also tends to be quite conservative. So it's not even that there's not an understanding, but there's very clear limitations on what that kind of capital can be used for. And I've been looking into this, looking into the development finance institutions who are supposed to provide a lot of the transition finance in the carbon space or the nature-based space. They cannot, they are mandated by their boards to be quite conservative and to be quite profit-seeking because they are backed by large pension funds. So the reality is that you do have to become quite creative. I just want to say, I want to make 3 points to kind of complement what Vincent and Joyeeta have been saying. So one is, if you want to be creative, you need to understand all the different options and financing instruments that you can use. And there's an amazing resource for this. Only Patton Power is a colleague and a good friend. She's an absolute rock star and pioneer in innovative finance. She wrote a book called Adventure Finance that actually details all the myriads of financing that small startups and SMEs can get that are not necessarily in the traditional domain. So happy to share her book. And also, I think she does a course on this. I have read the book and I've done the course, and amazing. It's absolutely amazing. Now, the second point I wanted to raise is you do need to really, really think about who you bring on board as an investor or a funder. It's the same for donors, by the way, because they will have their own kind of expectations. And the way to think about it is, it's like, who do you want around your dinner table like every single night? That is the level of closeness that you need to be comfortable with. And when an organization is in dire need of money, you may actually think that, whatever I can get, but don't let that vision alignment, that very, very strong values alignment go away, because it can literally ruin your life. And on the upside, if you do find those people, it's the same as what Joyeeta said, that are mission and vision aligned and you share the same values, what they can bring to the table is way more than the money. And it's going to be just this amazing co-creation. And the third point that I wanted to say is try to find as patient capital in the beginning as possible and not try to necessarily solve your entire funding problem at once. Think about what is the minimum funding you need to get to the next tranche, and just secure that, because that will allow you to, at the earlier stage you are, the higher risk your company or organization is, and the higher the cost of capital will be. So you don't need to, yes, of course, in this VC model is like, oh, great, we'll get a couple of million together and then another couple of million. It's not necessarily the right model, because, when you have investors with that kind of return expectations, it also pushes you into a certain channel or avenue. And I can guarantee that it's not going to be in the direction of how can we holistically regenerate the earth. So
Mhm.
actually just focusing on what is the money that I need and try to get it from as patient capital sources as possible is, I think, allows you time to really refine your business model, to really understand how you can create change and test and iterate without that intense pressure that you need to generate profits and returns, very fast, because only then can the investor get the kind of like insane returns. Anyways, I don't think nature is VC backable yet. So we're not in, and we feel extremely fortunate at Fair Carbon that we are funded by a Swiss venture philanthropy called Gallifrey Foundation, who are 100% vision aligned and who provide that kind of patient capital, and it allows us to test and iterate and pivot and change direction based on what we're learning and the feedback that we're getting from the market. So yes, these were my 3
Okay.
cents.
Thank you, Diana. Yeah, I mean, there's so much to unpack in there, but our time is low, unfortunately. One thing I wanted to maybe highlight is you said that it's not necessary that venture capital is appropriate for the organization. I agree, but it also applies to for-profit entities that are not even in the climate or regenerative space. It's very important to really make that decision because they become your boss, right? So no matter what, those investors have a say of who leads the company, for instance, when they're on the board, and sometimes they decide it's not you, right? So there are lots of important relationships here as a in financing.
Can I say one thing about that? Because you can
It is
set up
very, very brief, yes.
Yeah, I was just saying you have a thing called steward ownership, and that's how we're structured too. And you can separate voting from profit power, for example. So none of our investors get voting powers unless they're very impact aligned. But generally, they do not get voting power. They only get profit power.
Interesting analogy, interesting point there, yeah. And that's also being used in the for-profit space. So before we turn to questions very briefly, these are the kinds of conversations we have at RegenIntel in our foundations course, right? The foundations course is a 15-week course where we have professionals, we have innovators like we have here today, and others explore where they fit and how they fit most appropriately within the regenerative world and within the climate space, right? So getting a climate job, doing it well, developing regenerative organizations, whether it's for-profit, non-profit, or hybrid, all of that are the kinds of things that we explore in the course. And it's a very diverse group that attends. We have people across the world, the global north, global south, wide range of backgrounds, and our reviews have been quite positive. So we're going into our cohort number 4. It's a virtual, live action course that starts from January 27, 2025. And we look forward to hearing more from anyone who's interested. Feel free to reach out to any of us. You will also get some information about that in the follow-up email after this session today. So we're going to turn to a few questions in our remaining few minutes. We do have one that was sent earlier from somebody online, I believe, and it's a general question for any of our panelists today. So the question is, what advice can the speakers offer to youths who are pursuing developing a career within sustainability? Any takers? Advice for youths.
Well, we talked briefly about education, right? And whether that was important or not. And I feel like this is a thing, for me, it's privileged to say, but I think I started doing entrepreneurship maybe 10 years too late. I should have just started when I thought like, oh, starting businesses is cool, but instead I waited and I studied and I was like, oh, I need to go to corporate first. And so I went to Adidas and then thought I would learn there, but actually I was bored out. And but so if you have strong social safety nets, and most people do not, but I do, and that's a privilege, why not try entrepreneurship earlier, right? When you have maybe no kids, no mortgage, no car, that's when you could take loads of risk. That's when you can burn a little bit of for example, we didn't raise any kind of capital, so you can also try and bootstrap for a long time. We did that, I spent very little money, and you can do that early in your career. When we've tried to hire founders, for example, it is much harder for a founder to join something early when they have kids or a mortgage, for example, because you're basically asking them to work for free, especially at very early stage starters. So maybe just start. That can be small, it can be big, it can be next to your job. I think that would be my main advice. Don't try and be perfect about it either. I think we pivoted like 2.5, maybe 3 times actually. And the first 2 times those were terrible ideas. So I think most founders have probably basically fucked up a couple times before they found the right thing, right? And my other advice would just be the very cliche one of not giving up, because you can give up because your idea is not working, but instead you should probably pivot. And then we did that once and it still didn't work, and then we pivoted again, and now I wouldn't call them pivots anymore, but we're still changing all the time.
Right.
Exactly.
Excellent. All right, thank you. And I think we have one last question. I know we're at time. If we have 1 or 2 more minutes of your time, everyone, one last question here is, if you could collaborate with any industry or sector outside of your own, what would it be and why? And maybe I'll lean towards Diana here because I love.
For one. Okay, so obviously there we see a lot of tech solutions when it comes to MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification for nature, and a lot of the current financing is going into those. But the reality is that when you're working with nature-based solutions, you're working with nature and people, 2 of the most unpredictable forces of the universe. And so for me, tech solutions won't get us out of this, and I don't know what sector that is, but I think something around how you can create high trust among stakeholders that have fundamentally different worldviews, very different backgrounds and experience and expectations. Because that skill set of bringing those people together and unite behind a shared vision is what's going to make or break a lot of these projects.
Excellent. All right, thank you. And we do have some amazing comments in the chat. We have a lot of thoughts there. We have a lot of people saying that this has been a great session. I'd love to thank you both, as well as Joyeeta, who had to leave a bit early for another engagement. But this has been really engaging. I think that we've shared a lot of insights that people who are considering founding, whether for-profit, non-profit, or something else, people who are already founding, who have founded something, who are looking to fundraise, there's a lot there. So before we close, why don't each of you just tell people how they can find you? What's the best way to get in contact with you? Maybe Vincent, you first.
I would say LinkedIn. If you write me on LinkedIn, I'll generally reply. That might be I'm busy, I'm not going to reply to this, or a couple lines, or if I'm really interested, can go further than that, but I'm quite active on LinkedIn. I would also recommend that to people. So I dropped the link in the chat just now already. So if you want, you can connect with me there.
Perfect. And we now know that you accept very long, heartfelt messages, right? So we know the kind of messages you're going to get today.
Yeah, write me long emails.
Yeah, exactly.
I echo that. LinkedIn is my go-to place. I think it's absolutely amazing, and yeah, happy to chat and respond. The one thing I'm not very keen to offer is a time to meet, because that time is very, very limited. So I want to first understand, what are we achieving in that meeting, and have that alignment first outlined in writing or in voice messages, whichever form.
All right, perfect. All right, Vin, Diana, and for Joyeeta, when you're seeing this recording, and for all of you who attended today, thank you. And you look out for an email from us with some updates and some offers. All right, thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
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 Bye-bye.